welcome to this session on open source software in the research and education landscape. My name is Casper Dreef and I'm joined here with my colleague and boss and manager and friend, Nicole Harris.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Harris. I work at GEANT with Casper, as he just said. We both work in the trust, identity and security area. So this isn't necessarily something you would expect us to be talking about, but it's an initiative we're setting off within GEANT at the moment, and we're hoping to take forward and to reinvigorate the use of open source software in the R&E environment.
Yes, and before we start with the presentation, we'd like to have this session bit discussion based. So if you have questions or comments throughout the session, just raise your hand and you can ask your questions anytime. And actually, even before we start with the presentation, we'd like to run a very short survey. And now I'm hoping that the screen sharing works again. Share this screen. It should. Yes. So we'd like to ask you, some of you already have your laptops open, otherwise you can also grab your phone, to go to menti.com, and then you'll be asked to use the code, which is at the top, but also at the bottom. You can also simply look into, I see people coming in. That's one thumbs up.
And anyone watching online, you can do this too.
Yep.
So you can, if you're online, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 22029186. Hopefully we'll get a few more people in.
3 people in now. Four. Slowly getting there. Five, 6. If you have any difficulties logging in, let us know. Maybe we can help out. 7, you can also join during, well, as long as you have the code. So maybe leave it open for a little longer. 7. Good to go?
Good to go, I think, yeah.
So we'd like to ask you a couple of questions before we start about open source software in your organization. And I hope it will go to the next slide. Yes. So, does your organization support open source software, the open source software philosophy? Yes, there was an immediate response by 2. So it's yes, no, I don't know. 4, yeah. Well, I think that's a 100% score. People support this. That's good, because that means that we can have a good discussion today. Second question, does your organization use open software services? And if yes, what services are you using at the moment? It's an open question, so type it in. It will appear on the screen. I think it also does multiple answers. So. That simple SAML. So some people from the Federation space. Linux, Open LDAP. Asterisk, do you know what asterisk is? I don't. So it's always nice to learn new things. File sender. An entire list of services. Right. So quite a long list. It's also good for us to know because we keep these results and can go back to our organization and say people are actually using this. So this is very useful for the community. Courier IMAP. All right. Well, substantial list. And even more. Jagger. Good. Quite a lot of people from the federation side of our world.
Yeah, and a lot of focus on the more operational elements of open source. So less user facing, I'd say here, further down the stack, and then moving up into the layer of LDAP and identity, but only really a couple that are more user facing, which is interesting.
All right, and so for those of you using OSS, are you running into barriers? You probably are, and if yes, it's also a multiple answers are possible here. What are the barriers for you to run these services? Maintenance? Well, across the board, basically.
Yes, I think that's interesting that maintenance is coming up strongly. Often people can get on board, implement the open source software to begin with, but then it needs the support, it needs the commitment from the organization, it needs frequent updates. And then from the other side, it also needs committers to frequently update and keep it relevant as well. And I think all of these things will come up as we talk further.
All right.
Yep.
This is not the last survey we'll do today, so keep your laptops open. Get back to the other screen. So, Nicole.
Okay, so let's talk in a little bit more detail about open source. I always really like this XKCD, a little cartoon. It's a bit difficult to see on this screen, but here we have a huge stack, a whole building of infrastructure, and then right down here at the bottom, here, and that's labeled as a piece of software being maintained by one guy in the middle of nowhere for a very long time. And this is some of the issues we have with open source software. Open source is everywhere, as we saw from the beginning. It's in our operational systems. It's pervasive all throughout the stacks of technology we use. And often it's very, very dependent on one developer or a couple of developers keeping things up to date and working for us. So here's a little story of open source gone wrong. I don't know if anyone knows what these very few lines of code are. It's quite easy to work out because I think the name's in the code. But this is something called leftpad. It's a really, really simple piece of code. It allows you to add characters at the beginning of a text. So, for example, it will add 0 to the beginning of a zip code. Very, very simple. Actually, any coder could just type this out themselves, right? But coders tend to be a little bit lazy when it comes to their coding. A young guy, 28 years old, frequently published code to a registry called NPM. It's a place to publish code so that other people can use it, specifically JavaScript type applications. And he would often post stuff there. He had a lot of stuff there. He actually had a different piece of software called Kik, K-I-K. But then another company set up called Kik.com. It's a chat service. They were doing reasonably well. They wanted to protect their IPR. They had a registered trademark. And they went to this young developer and said, we don't
mean to be rude about this, but, could you maybe call that piece of code something else because this is a registered trademark? We don't want to get the lawyers involved. Unfortunately, the young developer just had a complete fit over this, said, I'm not changing the name of my code. You'll have to go away. You can sue me. And then in the end, he pulled all of his code out of the registry because of this argument. So not just the Kit code, but all of the code. A lot of it had no impact whatsoever. He published lots and lots of different pieces of code in many, many different ways. But this specific piece of code, this ridiculous 6 lines or so of code, caused significant problems because it was used by many, many people pulling directly from the registry. And when this went down, so many different services went down. So that when we think about open source and we think about our use of it, it's not just about a specific tool that we're using, but it could be anywhere within any code that you're using, and it can be very precarious, our dependency on it. Open source is absolutely everywhere, as I said. This is a fantastic graphic, which I didn't put together, I stole from IBM, but it just shows all throughout the ecosystem, no matter where we are, there can be open source software at work. And this doesn't even really cover some of the open source software we're using regularly within the R&E community. When we started talking, people mentioned things like Shibboleth, Simple SAML, and Casper and I are going to talk a bit more about specific R&E open source services as we move on. So open source is everywhere. Organizations use it, whether they have a strategy to use it or not, and whether they intend to use it or not. So what can we do about it? And are we focused enough as NRENs, as research and education, as universities on open source and how we're using it? This is a question we've been asking a lot at GEANT recently. There's been a big swing towards buying services, particularly end user facing services. The pandemic had a big impact on that. Everyone rushed out and bought Zoom licenses. People were looking for learning management systems so people could work from home. And those decisions had to be made quickly. So the best idea was just to simply quickly buy something. But is that the best thing we should be doing? And can we think about things a little bit more differently? So something that Casper and I are kicking off as part of the community program at GEANT is something called the Open Source Software Services Principles. When we think about how we're using open source, we think it's quite difficult to have a specific project on it. Every university is different. Every single NREN is different. What we think we can do, though, is all agree on a consistent approach to what we're doing. So we've put together a proposed set of 10 principles. And what we're going to do is firstly get those agreed by some of the most active people in our field in terms of open source, and then ask NRENs to endorse them, to say, actually, we agree with this. And from the beginning, I think the people in this room perhaps might already agree with them, but we'll see where we're going. Then we intend to run some little campaigns every year focused on one of the different principles. But hopefully that will become a little bit more apparent as I move through these slides. So our very, very first principle is quite a big one. It's a statement that we believe that digital sovereignty cannot be achieved without a robust open source infrastructure. Within the EU, digital sovereignty has become a really, really big talking point recently. It's one of their main focuses. And there are many pillars looking at this. Lots of different things are driving that forward. There's things like GDPR, which talks a lot about, owning your own data, making sure the data of your users is looked after well. There was the Schrems case, which challenged exchange of information with the US, for example. We've seen things like the US Cloud Act come in, which is causing people a lot of concern. CLOUD stands for Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data. Someone put a lot of work into trying to work out that acronym. But it basically puts requirements on a lot of US-based companies to hand data over to people like the FBI if they're investigating things. And they just have to hand that over. And that's causing a lot of people quite a bit of concern about whether that will happen. And a lot of the disagreement with sharing data with the US comes from this. Why do we care about that? Well, obviously, a lot of the big five service providers that we use all have servers in the US, all have staff based in the US who are processing data. Digital sovereignty, though, has tended to focus pretty much on the data itself. We're really worried about data, both in terms of our research data, other data outputs from our work, and in terms of personal data, so the stuff we hold about our users. There's not been so much focus on the actual infrastructure itself. So where's the technical sovereignty? Are we locked into certain technical implementations? And if we are, it doesn't really matter if we have data sovereignty. We need to care about the technical base and the technical infrastructure too. There's a couple of other things that are happening over in the EU. The EU does have an open source software strategy, but it's sort of sat in the background and not much has happened with it for a long time. And it's also running out in 2024. So we need to think about what we're doing there. There's also something in the EU called the EU Digital Decade. And that's all about putting people at the center, providing freedom of choice, safety and security, participation, sustainability. If we start thinking about all of these different things, then actually being locked into big service providers, relying on Amazon, relying on Meta and all of their services, are we really doing the right thing for our users? Microsoft would be another big one there. And can we really use those and meet these objectives? And then the final one, which I think is quite important for NRENs, is about public values. We are not just, a commercial organization. We care about our users. We care about what we do. I was really struck listening to the minister in the keynote this morning about how much he cares about what the NRENs are doing and what difference we're making in a societal factor. So there's other things that come up around ethics, around how we collaborate, how we innovate, that are really, really important. And we can think about all of those as part of an open source strategy and a real driver as to why we should be using open source tools. I'm going to then hand over to Casper to talk about the next couple of principles.
So thank you. This is very small on the screen. Principle number 2, we will actively contribute to open source developer communities with code and financing, especially where code is used by NRENs and their community. Next couple of slides will go into a little bit more detail on that, because I had an idea on how we could do that. And principle number 3 is we will foster co-creation in NREN communities to help build public services across organizational silos and boundaries, including support for capacity to create our own code. And this also fits nicely into the next couple of slides. Because I've been thinking about creating something called a services starter pack. So, Nicole, as Nicole already said in our introduction, that we work a lot in the trust and identity space. I am the secretary for both EduGAIN and EduRoam, and especially in EduGAIN, we see get a lot of questions about services, but also when you look into the entities, and with that I mean identity providers and service providers in EduGAIN, you see that for especially the recent joiners in the EduGAIN service, the number of entities are fairly low. This can be due to the fact that more and more federations set up their federations in a way that they use proxies a lot. So on the surface, you will only see one IDP, but in fact, it's a proxy with more IDPs behind that, and same goes for SPs. But if you actually go into the detail, you look into the numbers, then still the number of SPs, especially in federations, are still relatively low. And with low number of participation, there is not a lot of metadata. We see a lot of errors in metadata with recent joiners. Luckily, they also reach out to us, to the support, and then to the EduGain support team, and we can help each other out and make their federation more robust. But having more metadata would actually, before you actually enter EduGain, would actually help to build the maturity of your federation before you even apply to EduGain. And also, we have a big difficulty of selling the idea of the federation to the constituency, so to identity providers and service providers. I've discussed this with EduGain Business Development over and over again. And when that's Mario Reale, my colleague at GEANT, and he says, every time I talk to emerging federations, or even NRENs that are thinking of setting up a federation, you always get the question, what services do you offer? And this is a bit of a misconception because EduGain in itself is actually the service. But that doesn't mean that EduGain could do more to offer more services through EduGain, make them available for federations to use. And historically, it also has been proven that it's very difficult to provide a good overview of all the services in EduGain. There are tools, but you really need to know what you're looking for. It's really specific. It's really hard. It's also, we have looked into the idea of creating a service catalog many times. And although it's doable, it's really hard to maintain it, to get all the proper information from service providers about their services and which services are actually available for your federation. And then the last problem on this slide is the uptake of open source software services in general. That has not much to do with federation per se, but I really think that identity federations can help with the uptake of open source software services. So what would a service starter pack mean for you? So, and how would it look like? So the idea is then to provide a standard set of federated services. And this will help the federation to become technically mature enough to join EduGain. And in this case, it would be good to start off with, we discussed this with Terry Smith earlier this week, to start off with test beds, test instances of these services, just to play around with services. How does it work? What metadata does it create? Then you can go to your constituency and can offer these services, create more metadata, make sure that you have all the technical skills that it requires that are required to run a federation, and then you can get into EduGain more smoothly and more seamlessly. And then we were thinking, these services, what should they be? What must they be? What should they look like? Well, first and foremost, if we want to do it for identity, if you want to offer it through identity federations, these services should be federated services. We are talking about open source software today, so the services should be open source based. The services on offer should be able to be hosted on-prem, so that you have the choice to run it yourself or use it a centralized service. And it would be fantastic if these services are developed by the NREN community and provided to the wider R&E community. Or as we like to say at GEANT, drink our own champagne. Yeah, rather than dog food, I think no one really likes to eat dog food, so rather drink champagne instead. So what would be the benefits of such a services starter pack? It would be really good for the EduGain operations team to do a maturity check. There's more metadata because there are more services. So there's more to check and to see if there are any flaws that can be fixed before you even enter it also really supports the idea of federation. And there's a really good example from Indonesia. They've started investigating. They started to spawn their identity federation called Federasi. And we've been in contact with them because they want to join EduGain, and we asked them, okay, what's your plan? How you want to grow inside your country? What would you like to offer? And they said, well, at first we had a really hard time selling the idea of federation, of identity federation. So what we did, and now I have to admit that I stole a little bit of their idea for this services pack. So what they actually did is offer a number of services, test instance to start off with, but a couple of services for file sharing, Eduroam, learning management systems, and a couple more, and show that to their peers, other universities in Indonesia. And they started very locally. They are based in Yogyakarta, so they reached out to the other faculties and universities in Yogyakarta. They organized a couple of workshops, and first they got in touch with 5 other universities and faculties, and they ran 3 or 4 of these workshops. So they started off with only 5 of them at the first workshop, and now they're doing it for 28 universities and faculties when they reach the number of when they reach the 4th workshop. So that's really impressive. This all happened within a year. So you can see a steep curve here, exponential growth. And what is mind-boggling to me is that they also told me that there are about 3,000 potential IDPs that could potentially join their federation. So if they're already at 28 now, and that number keeps on doubling, they'll have probably one of the largest federations in the world on the IDP front. So it supports the idea of federation because you offer services. You can tell your constituency, well, this is what you can actually do with federated services. This is what you can offer to your students, to your researchers, to your teachers. The other benefit, of course, is then the uptake of OSS services, because there are more people using it, and then also more federations that are using it. And with this service pack, the idea is that it's a list of services. You don't have to use them all. You can just pick. You can also choose between different flavors of the services, and that is what I will show in 2 slides. This is a bit more discussion. So what services should be included in this starter pack? What should it look like? So if you reach out to the EduGain service and ask for the starter pack, what would we actually offer you? And what are other benefits of using a service pack, a starter pack? And I would be very happy to get your input on that. You can think of that now. This question will be asked later in the session, at the end of this session. So I'd love to hear your ideas on this as well. So been thinking about some of the service that could be offered. And earlier this week, I realized this is actually quite a relevant topic, because in the identity and access management sessions earlier this week, quite a few of the participants asked about killer apps. This is a list of 6 services, so I would talk about not about killer apps, but about a killer 6-pack. But yeah, in all fairness, there is no killer app that will attract all of your universities and research institutions. But maybe if you can offer a package, then it becomes more interesting. So we have been thinking about a couple of types of services, which all of these have been created in the NRAN community. no, not all of them, but most of them have been. So we think about VPN, which is obviously in the VPN service, EduMeet and Rendezvous, video conference services. One was created in the GEANT project. The other one was created by the French Federation of French NREN Renater. We've been thinking about offering a Confluence or Wiki file sender. We already saw that on the list on the Mentimeter earlier. So that's a file sharing solution. Mailing list manager. We use Simpa, open source software, also created by the French NREN. And we're thinking about event managers, and there are also a couple of flavors there, and that's what I mean with pick and choose. You don't have to get all of them, but you can use some of them. There are probably more than one solution per type of service, so you can choose which one of them suits your constituents best. And well, later today, I will ask you if you can think of other services that would fit well in a services starter pack. So what should it look like? My basic idea was that it would be very simple. Basically an instruction manual. So how do you set up these services? And this would be a collection of all these installation instructions, basically, which will also describe how you should set up and run these services yourself, and with contact details provided of the core services team. So, well, in case of the EduVPN team, of EduVPN, their core service team, and they can help you and guide you with setting up yourself, but you can run the services yourself. And the support, and here we see a little bit of a shift, that the Identity Federation becomes the service provider. What does that mean for support? First level support is you talking to your constituents. If they have questions, you should be the first level of support, first line of contact. And if you are not sure how to solve the questions and the support that is asked, then you can also always reach out to the core services team. They will provide the second level of support. This could also have other benefits, the starter pack, because you're setting up your federation from scratch and with services in a way that you would like to set it up. You could start thinking of introducing entity categories, specific entity categories. We discussed this in depth over the last couple of days in the IM sessions. Those have all been recorded. So if you don't know know much about identity categories, I would like to refer you to the recordings of these sessions. And the other benefit of open source software in general is that you have an influence on the development of the service. So you could work on new features yourself, or you could ask the core service team if they can are willing to look into new features or new plugins anyway, to make a service most suitable for your organization and for your constituency. And with that, I leave it. Well, I'll give the mic back to Nicole.
So some software service or some open source software already has fairly well documented integrations into Shibboleth and other open source identity tools. Will you be looking at providing links to those as well as this additional documentation around how to set this stuff up?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we're lucky enough to work quite closely with a lot of the development teams, and we're hoping to really get them on board and actually look at pulling support from them as well.
So I'm a network operation guy from Japan, and I was kind of looking at the website and found that network management as a service. So in that sense, there was I didn't quite remember strictly, but there was some Helm charts available for the Kubernetes server. So I'm not quite sure it is related what you're working on or not, but that is far beyond some manual. So I guess I want how about that? So turning up the Kubernetes service is not quite a job for in the 2023. So maybe
I guess indeed this is a bit out of scope of the Federation starter pack, but as Nicole explained at the start, is that we just are reiterating this work on open source software within GEANT and within the community. So hopefully, at some point in time, in the not so distant future, this will be far more comprehensive, right? So it also includes network operations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we're focusing more on user-facing services that use open source at the moment within this initiative, but we're hoping this principles work will really give a refocus across the board. So yeah, things like the network management tools, where they're also using a lot of open source tools and trying to develop out in that space as well. Definitely better people to talk about that space than Casper and I, but people like Enzo and Helga at the conference too. So they'll be good to chat to.
So actually, what I would have thought adding a help desk within the starter pack. So because when you are enrolling a new services, there will be a lot of users coming with multiple questions and then having small workforce. So it might be useful to go or some sort of KB.
Yeah. That's definitely something we're looking at. And this next section actually speaks to those challenges a bit. It's something we're hoping to do. There'll definitely be some level of support. We're still working out how deep we can go with that. But as you say, the kind of the tools that we're talking about, like EduVPN, Shibboleth, Simple SAML, those kind of things, we know the development teams well. So we're going to build up a relationship with them, and it would actually benefit them to work with us on providing that support out, because support for open source is a big challenge space, which is part of this next point. I think there's another question behind you, Casper.
Yeah, I'm Basuki. I'm from Indonesia. Yeah, we try to develop the Edu Rome and Edu GEANT. Yeah, it's different. Right? Sometimes maybe Andres mentioned about the different things like even our equipment is mostly in Indonesia, not compatible with the standard of 1x protocol. Yeah, that's what's happened in Indonesia. So that's why not many university will join, because the authentication system is rather different. And the second, actually, I will ask about the sustainability itself. Sustainability of you mentioned about the support and sustainability, because for example, like right now we in Indonesia mostly using the open source, but you see, like in the beginning we used the FreeBSD, and then the FreeBSD support one release is around two years, and then we moved to the CentOS, and then CentOS is 5 years, but now CentOS is not support again, and then now we moved to Ubuntu or in the Debian. So it is for the admin, maybe this is very it's difficult. When we have to move one to other, and then do you have something like ASEAN have some idea about how to maintain something like that, like the sustainability, like this is what we try to establish actually. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why we're focusing on a very small set of services. You remember at the beginning, I showed that massive chart. We couldn't say we could support all of that. So we're starting off with a small set, and we're hoping to move it forward. But I think it's a good point to move forward, because all of your comments kind of speak to the next two of our open source principles that we're developing. The first one is we will support open source projects with sustainable business plans, and specifically outside of project funding. Because one of the issues we've seen, particularly with people who are used to EC project funding or other big government funding, is that when that runs out, all of the support vanishes and disappears. So we need models that can support things outside of secular project funding. And the second one is we will support sustainable infrastructures for services built on open source software. And this is also speaks to the starter pack that Casper was just talking about. But I don't think I have to say to anyone in this room that open source is not just code. You can have your guy sitting writing code saying, I want to make that available out to everyone. That's super cool. That can be super, super useful. But once things get used in a robust way, more and more things are needed. So we start with the code, but then any code needs auditing, it needs testing, it needs looking at compliance and security checks. And that's often much better done by someone who's not the original coder. So how do we get that done? We need things like IPR, copyright, licenses, contributor agreements. And if you're a guy who just wants to write code, you're not going to be wanting to sit there thinking about IPR and getting people to sign documents. You need help and support there. We need marketing. We need to promote them. We have things like EduVPN, which have beautiful websites. Our developers aren't doing that. Someone else is doing that for them. Customer support is the next big thing. Really, really important. How is that being done? Is it just being done through mailing lists, through community support, or is there a help desk you can go to? Or can you buy support in some way to support what you're doing locally? And then most importantly, at the end, how is all of this being financed? I can't remember the number of times when I've spoken to people and they've just gone financing, but open source is free. Someone is always paying for the development somewhere, whether it's individuals contributing their time and effort, whether it's organizations contributing that back out into the community. But everyone knows that creating open source is not free, and having an open source service within your infrastructure is not free. You need the manpower, you need the people to support it. One of the things we did in the EU to try and look at this was we created something called the Commons Conservancy, and I'm actually one of the board members of the Commons Conservancy. When I started at GEANT 10 years ago, we were looking at how we could best support our open source projects at the time. We were looking at things like Shibboleth and Simple SAML, and there was no mechanism that worked for us. All the big conservancies were US based. That was a challenge for us in terms of the way that our software was financed and supported. It was a challenge for us making how we were developing fit their model. And it really didn't quite meet all of our needs. We wanted something that addressed all of these points that I just went through, and that really helped developers directly to build up their projects into robust and secure open source services. So this is why we created the Commons Conservancy. It's a not-for-profit foundation. It's quite an interesting one. It cannot receive money. It's entirely forbidden from taking and handling money. We do have mechanisms in place to allow projects to be funded, but the Conservancy cannot take in any money. And what that does is it invites open source projects to apply to become part of the Conservancy. When they apply, we have a long conversation with them about what they need. What support do they need? Are they looking for a developer? Do they need legal support? Do they need help marketing? Do they need help setting up a way of bringing money in? And the Conservancy will do all of those things. It doesn't do coding itself. It's just a framework to help you find all of those pieces of the puzzle so that you can provide a decent software. You can focus on the coding. You can focus on what you're specialized at, and we'll take care of everything else. It's been pretty successful. We've quite a number of projects or programs, as we call them, in the Conservancy there. A lot of the R&E projects are now in the Commons Conservancy. So if you're interested in that, please do and go and take a look. But keeping an eye on time, because we're running out quickly, I'm going to hand over to Casper to talk about 6 and 7 of our principles.
So principle 6, we will support and promote open source alternatives to proprietary services. And principle 7, we will position procurement activities to be welcoming to open source initiatives. The next, just a little bit of a disclaimer. The next two slides we borrowed from René Teyer from their TNC presentation, which was excellent. So thanks, René Teyer, for borrowing your slides. That also means that these bikes are not relevant to this presentation whatsoever. They were in their slides, but we kept them because it's a happy picture. But the title is very relevant. Go figures, and I think they deliberately called it figures because what we hear a lot if you're talking about newly created open source software services is that, yeah, it doesn't really work well, and we need more computing power. We need a node here and we need a node there, and the service doesn't offer that yet. So it cannot do the thing that we wanted to do. But as a famous Dutch football player once said, sometimes things need to happen before they actually happen. So if you actually are running these open source software services, yeah, you are actually becoming a part of the solution. You add gravitas to these services, and these numbers speak for themselves. So they're Evento service. It's a event manager, but also something similar as Doodle, so you can schedule dates. In a year's time, they had 250,000 surveys run on that with 2 million users. And a couple of other examples, Rendezvous, 150,000 video calls made by more than 20,000 users. And the list grows on. File Sender, 9 million uploads and 25 million downloads. That is quite a substantial number. And their final service that is hosted by 45 of their organizations that are part of their NREN. This shows that it's fairly easy to, in a medium-sized country like France, to create this user base, which will also help you to convince your management that it's worth investing in OSS services. But then, why free software? There are positive as well as negative preconceptions here. First, the positive ones. It works well. It's better than proprietary because we do it ourselves. It defines interoperability standards. It's completely adaptable. We can make it work as we want. But there are also negative preconceptions. It's always buggy. Bug fixes are always late compared to proprietary services. And it's probably due because it's impossible to find good tags. And it costs as much as proprietary services, but it actually causes more work for us. And the end users will probably hate it. Guess what? These are all misconceptions. So a couple of examples of services that have been mentioned in the starter pack, but also on the level below. These are commercial services versus open source services. Zoom and EduMeet. We've been in a session at TNC where people said, well, EduMeet is not quite there yet. And then I asked, well, did you actively invest it in EduMeet? Because if you do, if you install the node yourself, if you install the service yourself, you become a part of, well, the solution. You add more computing power, so you can actually do exactly the same thing as Zoom. And talk to the service team of EduMeet, and they are launching their 2.0 version that actually integrates File Sender into the video conferencing services, which is great. But also you can also see you can use WeTransfer. File Sender can do exactly the same thing. You can decide to use a commercial VPN. Absolutely not, nothing wrong with that. But we also have EduVPN. And then on the identity management side, yeah, Microsoft Azure is widely used. But yeah, EduGain is predominantly run on Shibboleth. So I'm not saying that using commercial software is wrong. Absolutely not. But there are good alternatives that are open source. I think next slide is yours. Point 7.
Yeah, so to speak to point 7, another big issue we find is that a lot of NRENs are actively required to procure anything they buy. And this seems to be very common with NRENs who have a close affiliation with government or ministries, where they have to be really, really careful about where they invest and spend their money. So many NRENs are required to undertake a procurement process for all purchases. So if they want to install something, they often say to us, we simply can't use the open source version. I have to run a procurement. And open source software can't respond to a procurement. So that's a big problem we're looking to address and looking to work with NRENs on. The other one is that they have difficulty to contribute to open source projects. They'd like to give them money to sustain them, but it's very, very difficult. Donations are very, very difficult to make, particularly if you're a not-for-profit organization yourself. You need an audit trail. People don't understand just giving money out to people. The projects themselves don't have robust invoicing or contractual approaches. This is something the Commons Conservancy is trying to address. And that there's a lack of clear service level agreements or formal support channels. So commercial services can sometimes be easier from a financial perspective. So people just go ahead, put out a tender, get a commercial solution, even if it's more expensive. And this is something we're really going to be focusing on in the EC over the next year or so, because we want to find solutions for our NRENs to free them up and enable them to use more open source software. So we're moving forward just to the last few points now. So 8 and 9 focus more on processes. And our principle number 8 is we will provide mechanisms to support the legal, licensing and IPR issues faced by open source projects. And number 9, we'll make sure the code we use and the code we share is free from vulnerabilities by applying continuous security testing. Something that's very, very important, but something that's very, very costly in terms of time and money. Does anyone know what this symbol stood for? Yeah, so this was Heartbleed. It's quite a long time ago now, even though some software still has the vulnerability in it. But this caused quite a big impact because OpenSSL is in a lot of services that people were using at the time. Anything that needed to be secured, you could pretty much bet that OpenSSL was in there somewhere. It was found in the cryptography layer. It was introduced to the software actually the vulnerability was actually introduced to the software in 2012, but was only publicly revealed in 2014. So that's quite scary. This vulnerability was in place for quite a long time. Up until that point, there was significant usage of OpenSSL, but nobody was supporting it. No one was giving any money to it. The yearly donations to the OpenSSL projects before Heartbleed were about $2,000 a year. I mean, what can you do with that? Next to nothing. At the time, OpenSSL only had 2 people to write, maintain, test, and review 500,000 lines of business critical code. And they weren't full-time. These were just 2 guys trying to keep this up and running. And that business critical thing is so important here. And the overall impact was estimated to be around $500 million. So $2,000 worth of input, donations gets you an impact of a cost of $500 million. The good news is this led to the creation of something called Project Zero at Google, which really focused on these kinds of pieces of software and that keeping an eye on these kind of vulnerabilities and finding ways to fund and support them. It led to significantly more funding for OpenSSL. But that's too late, right? The vulnerability had already happened. The issue had already happened. It would have been much better if we had looked at this beforehand. It was a massive failure of risk analysis on our part. We just weren't thinking about what our critical infrastructure was depending on. Looking at some of the other things, this is one of my colleagues, Magdalena Razka. She's been working a lot on IPR policies for us. It's boring work, but it's really essential work. And this isn't about really protecting our IPR. This isn't us trying to do a land grab and saying this is ours. This is just about being very clear about our IPR, particularly if we are providing services out to people. For example, we provide a lot of code through things like EduRoam and EduGain. Is our IPR policy very clear on that? If we've had a developer work on that project, are we clear that we own their IPR so we can make it available to other people? She's done a fantastic piece of work on that. If people are interested in the policy, I'm happy to share it. We're happy for people to reuse it if they want to locally. And then something else we do, and this is funded through one of the only things we've been talking about today, which is actually funded through the GEANT 5 project, is we do a lot of work on providing secure code services for our community. We have something called the School of Software Engineering, which runs yearly, where a bunch of our developers all get together and geek out together and have a lot of fun, and also work on each other's code, challenge each other's code. We provide a lot of software best practices. We do secure code reviews. We find it challenging. It's in labor-intensive work. We can only fund and support so many pieces of code review through that, but we find it really, really important. And we're trying desperately to expand that out. And then finally, we have a software catalog so people can find out a bit more about some of the software that's made available. But this is just GEANT 5 project focused. We're trying to find ways to scale that outside the project. So I think that brings us on to our last point, and I think it's a very important point to make. All of these things we've talked about are not about being militant about open source. It's about saying there's an alternative and there's a different way of doing things. And we support all of these actions around open source as part of a mixed ecosystem. So we want to select and work with both open and closed environments to best meet the needs of the NREN community. So as both Casper and I have said several times, this isn't about you must use open source, commercial is bad. It's about just saying, let's not just rely on commercial. Let's look at our options. Let's think about a mixed ecosystem, because actually that can provide more benefits for our community. There's lots of areas where we think we need to do a lot of work, not just at GEANT, but hopefully with our global partners as well. And we'd be interested in talking to all of you guys about this. We feel that a shift to buy rather than build over the last 10 years or so has really shifted attention away from open source software. And this means we are not paying attention to risks and dependencies. It's definitely true that our developer capacity has declined. Lots of people have been drawn away. Why would you work for an NREN if you can go and work for Google? We need to make that more attractive again. But where we do have developer capacity, we are not necessarily smart in its application. We often develop multiple of the same products rather than collaborating. I can give an example. Recently, 3 of our NRENs have all developed digital signing services. All of them are open source. All of them can be used by anyone else, but all developed completely in silos. It's not a very smart application of a very small amount of resource. We definitely need more work to professionalize our support for homegrown open source software, our own software that we're developing. And the Commons Conservancy is one step towards that. We developed that, but then we kind of stopped. We need to do more. And we really think we need a position as to how we ethically use open source software. So this is about saying, okay, if I take this open source software, if I'm going to use OpenSSL, if I'm going to use, for example, Indico, which is the GEANT event management system, am I just taking it, or are we contributing back in some way? Because if I'm getting something for free, can I give back? And that doesn't necessarily mean a payment or donation. It could be giving back in developer time, in helping with bug fixes, in being involved in the community boards around discussions. But if we are taking, let's think about how we give back. So those are our 10 open source principles. They're here, they're a little small, but hopefully you can look at the slides afterwards. Our next step is we are going to get these ratified by something called the GEANT Community Committee. And then we're going to publish them, and we'll be asking NRENs and other organizations to endorse them, and then to help work with us on trying to solve some of the problems we've talked about today in this slide deck, and also try and provide some of the solutions like the service pack that Casper talked about. And I'm going to hand back over to Casper now.
Yes, because this is the end of our slide deck, but we have one more how you call it, one more survey to go. And I now have to start that one up and share the screen. So I'd like to ask you to, let's see, what's the good one? That one. Sure. To go to menti.com again. Now we have a different code to enter the survey. So that's 2182666. And then the first question, I think you can start entering your, entries immediately. What services would you like to see in the starter packs? Would you like to have us adding more services to this starter pack? But as we got the question earlier, let's open it up. Where can we work together on what services, open OSS services that we know of that are NREN build, NREN community build? Could we do more together? And the first answer is already great because those are two services I haven't heard about. So let's give us more homework. That's good. File sender, yes. And we see in file sender, we see a lot of spawning, emerging identity federations testing out their IDPs and SPs with file sender. That's good. Routing, PKI, DNS, Mattermost, Docker images, Azure VPN, yeah. More DNS. I'm gonna wait for Terry until he managed to get into Menti. OpenStack. And again, more services that do more or less the same is not a bad thing. I think that gives you the opportunity to choose whatever you want, what works best for you, right? So I'll remove this, otherwise we can't see what's notebooks. Well, quite a few ideas. If over the matter of time you come up with more, then you can always reach out to us. Oh, there's still more entries coming in.
The DevSecOps ops is interesting. We're doing quite a bit of work on that at GEANT too. Really realizing that there's a lot of work to be done in that space. I don't think it will be our primary focus, but we're definitely going to be talking to those guys about how we can work together. Because we have so many different tools we're using in that space, mixed economy, sometimes overlapping tools, and just trying to get a better handle on what we're doing and what decisions we're making to support that kind of work. But yeah, Big Blue Button is a good one. Things like Mattermost as well would be interesting, I think, to add to the portfolio.
Yep, absolutely. And it's good to see that most of these services are also very interoperable. And today, actually, we would have run the session with a third colleague from Nordinet, A. Kikkenborg, who has a lot of experience with technical implementation of services. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it to Sri Lanka. But I've worked with Erik on a couple of projects in the past that are looking into learning management systems and their operability with other solutions. And then we found out that it's really that open source is really suitable when it comes down to operability with, well, other services. Okay, next question. Thank you for your responses. So how should we go about? I have my ideas. I think Nicole has hers, but we'd like to hear it from you. So this effort on OSS services should be managed and supported on a local level. Would you like to prefer to run it by yourself? Regional level? So, well, the APAN region, global level, or it depends on the service, which is always the easy answer, but probably also the most true answer. Right, so answers coming in. It depends on the service. Yes, I agree, but I'm also happy to see that we got some regional and global level answers here. We'd like to run this as a community thing, and of course we are here representing GEANT, but I think when it comes down to open source software, these services are global services, right? We don't only do it in, well, our home offices in the Netherlands or the UK. This and the service become better with more input from more areas, more countries.
So when you say like regional level, if you had a project group or an activity, or we've got our Biocommons community, and that community runs a bunch of software at the regional level, but then shares it globally as well. They're on all sorts of stuff. They're actually bringing that into the federation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the federation operator that's got to do all the hard work and run this stuff.
Absolutely.
There are other communities that you can go and talk to who already have stuff out there, but would benefit from joining an identity federation and having a global collaboration activity.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, and think of use cases for local level and regional level that would come down to services that are only targeting specific languages, for instance. I mean, English is globally used language, but if you offer a service only in Dutch, then it doesn't really make sense to run this on an international scale, because there are, well, not many people who are using a service that is only in Dutch.
Yeah, and I think there are definite ways where we can mix the support models there. So FileSend is a good example. They provide support centrally. The coding's done centrally. But translations have been sort of donated for the interface from various native speakers, so that we can make sure that an organization who wants it in their native language can get access to that. And that's just done through some simple translation. We've kept the interface as simple as possible, so the translation work is minimal, and that gets contributed through a GitHub repository. And that's a really simple way that regional level support can be added to a more global level initiative.
Okay, then. I think this is the final question. So if you're interested in joining this activity, what can your organization bring to the table? What can you offer? No support is also a good answer. Completely understand that, especially we see that globally, that we and Nicole talked about it as well. Staffing issues, resourcing issues hit all of us. But it seems like you really like to be involved in here, and that is really nice to see. Oh, that's good. We have 8 people in the room who can do the maintenance for some of these services that we have discussed earlier today. No, this is really good, and I'm very happy that we were allowed to run this session today at this conference, because, well, we've just, as said, we just initiated this this work a couple of months ago, but it's really nice to see that that there are more people that, well, more or less think the same as us. We should do this again. We should investigate a little bit more. I think this was, yep, that was the final final question. We will publish the slides. We'll also publish the results of these two surveys on WUFA. So if you want to look it back later, that is possible. You can always reach out to us. Come to see us today. Nicole's leaving end of the day, but well, we will be there at dinner, but also tomorrow. Contact us online. And if you have questions at a later point in time, also very welcome to reach out to us. Maybe before we really close the session, maybe you have questions or comments now that you would like to share with us, or maybe also people online if you have questions. The floor is open.
Hi, I'm Shankar from Malaysia. So I'm just having a question on the notion of starter pack that you had. So are you looking at a package of tools and services that will come together, or are we looking at, let's say, deployment of them one by one, or are we looking at something like the turnkey Linux solutions where we pretty much have them to auto deploy as we wish? That's
at this point in time, I'd like to keep it as simple as possible. So probably it's me who's going to do the work. Is well, I've shared these. Well, maybe I can get that slide back. That's maybe useful to do that. Go back. All the French slides. There we are. Here. So this was just some initial ideas, right? So we can add, we can scrape things off if there is no need for these services. But I think the most important thing about this is that you are not obliged to take up all the services. Pick and choose. Also, it would be really great to, and therefore these two surveys really help me to collect different services that do more or less the same thing. So we discussed a big blue button, so that should be added to the list of Rendezvous and EduMeet, whatever works for you. And then yeah, I think the simplest thing to do, because I also have limited hours in a week, is to compile these instruction manuals, how to download, how to run it yourself. And then, as Nicole said, we are in close contact with service teams that actually develop these services. Make them aware that this is coming, right? That you are coming, that you're going to ask them for help. And well, I know that they're quite passionate about their product, so they're probably also very passionate to help you setting up these services yourselves. But yeah, again, you can pick whatever you want, but at least you have something then on offer and can show.
My question wasn't about what will be there, how it will be deployed.
So obviously with any open source, there's different models we could be looking at. So for some people, it may be that they just simply want to download their own instance, run it locally. That level of support is the easiest. So then we'd be looking at simply, as Casper said, making sure there's good installation guides, you have support, we're working with the project teams, but also thinking about, I mean, that in itself is a challenge, though, right? That's a lot of work. Lots of organizations just don't have the capacity for that. Certain things are more difficult, something like EduVPN, we wouldn't be able to offer a centralized service for, but there are a couple of the options where we're saying, okay, well, we have filesender.geant.org, can we make that available for other people? Are there other hosting options we can look at? That's going to be a slower process. We may introduce one thing. We have a couple of options I can think about that would be easy to do and see if we can scale up. But step one would be sort of like the pack, the instructions, local download, local support. Then second level, can we provide, you know, hosting for people, and then slowly moving up as we go along.
So are you from a university? Yeah, so your university might want to stand up the service, but for the whole of the nation. Yeah, and that's what we have a lot of in Australia. This university will run it for everybody across the nation, rather than each university running their own instance. And when you start going down that model, other universities will start helping you run that service, keep it going, giving you support, running local support teams at their universities just to support that centralized service. Not run by the NREN, but run by you guys. And that's a really good model.
Otherwise, I think it's just to say thank you so much for coming. It was lovely to see so many people here. If you want any more information, you know where to find us. You can come scan our badges. And we'd love to keep the conversation going and hopefully come back with a bit more of a developed service for you at some point in the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all.